For those of you who haven't had an opportunity to meet me before, my name is Bronwyn. I'm the manager here at Shoalhaven Regional Gallery. It's our absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to welcome our two special guests, Morecroft and Irwin. We've had quite a few conversations over the last 12-18 months that Richard has led for us with artists, art personalities, curators and others. And each time Richard manages to pull out some rather wonderful insights, discussion and stories. So I know that tonight, with the history Rex has in the art world, with his incredible connections, knowledge and background, I know that you're going to hear something fascinating, delightful, humorous and insightful. With that challenge, gentlemen, I will pass it over to you. Please welcome Rex and Richard.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. You have indeed thrown down the gauntlet, and I hope that I'm sure that Rex and I will do our very best to respond. Look, welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. This is more than a packed house, and it's lovely that you've all been able to come along to join us this evening. Now, before we actually get underway and I introduce Rex, you can tell probably I'm not using a microphone. Can everybody hear me reasonably clearly?
Yeah.
And Rex, I might get you to kind of state your name, rank and serial number or something like this, or just to make a general greeting, just to see that everyone can hear you as well.
Think of this as the portrait of an unknown old man.
Did everybody
catalogue details?
Did everybody get that little bit of self-deprecation even at the back? Excellent. All right. Well, look, let's get underway, and I'll perhaps counter that with a little bit of flattery to begin with, because it's appropriate. Because it is a great pleasure tonight to be able to have someone, and I know this word is overused, but it's not inappropriate tonight, to have someone who is an icon of the Australian art world and has been for just several decades. I won't tell you what he whispered, but it was a lot of years. So Rex Irwin is somebody who has had the most extraordinary life in art in Australia. And through his gallery, Rex Irwin Art Dealer, he has brought to so many people in Australia, but also, of course, many enthusiastic clients, quite extraordinary contacts with the world of art, with the world of Australian art, but perhaps even sometimes more excitingly in the scale of the contact, some international art. If you wanted to buy a Picasso in Australia, you went to see Rex. If you wanted to buy a Lucian Freud in Australia, you went to see Rex. If you wanted to buy a David Hockney in Australia, you went to see Rex. But if you wanted to buy great Australian artists like Cressida, Campbell or Nicholas Hardy, you also went to see Rex, or Fred Williams, or any number of names that we might hear tonight. So the people that Rex has dealt with and the experiences that he's had are experiences which those of us who have, and I'm sure everybody here tonight does have an enthusiasm for the world of visual art, they're experiences that are almost beyond our wildest dreams. And it's wonderful that Rex has come along tonight to share some of those, and hopefully I can tease them out of him. But as many of you would know, Rex now is essentially a local. He has retired from his gallery and he's now living in Kangaroo Valley. So a big welcome to you, Rex. Thank you for coming along tonight. And look, let's go to just a particular moment straight away, which is when David Hockney rang you up and said, I want to do your portrait, but you were a bit busy.
Yes. David Hockney, when he comes to Australia, has an unnerving habit of just ringing you and saying, hello, love. And you don't know whether he's in Bradford or he's in Sydney. Anyhow, he said this wonderful thing, and he said, can you come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock? And I heard myself saying, well, I'm terribly sorry, David, I'm having a haircut. And he said, cancel it, love. And so I did. And he did, and people said, oh, did he give it to you? And of course, when people do portraits of other people, they can't give them away because they have to sell them to other people. So he gave me a copy, which was an exact life-size copy, and he signed it as a copy of a copy by David Hockney.
So what is it like to sit down in front of one of the great international artists of this century and have your portrait captured by that person? What do you do? Do you look into their eyes? Do you look aside? Do you have conversation? What happens?
This was a particular period of David Hockney when he was using a prism, and I don't know if any of you followed it, but he's been exploring the use of prisms and lenses in the history of art. And if you use a prism, you put it above your sheet of paper, and I can look at you, and your image appears on the paper. So he can trace around it, but there is actually no image on the paper, it's within the prism. So I had a slightly inane smile on my face, because everybody sits rather sort of po-faced when they're having their portrait done, but I realised the reason is you can't keep an inane smile on your face forever. However, David, being one of the great draftsmen, did, I think, a perfectly nice drawing, and but he never appears like the great man. He's unbelievably generous, and in fact, I spoke to him, or I emailed him yesterday on behalf of Nicholas Hardin, who wanted to use a quotation of his about drawing, and 10 minutes later he said, of course you can have copyright. So he's a kind, generous, thoughtful man. He might drive the people who are around him demented, because every time he has a new project he wants to tell everybody. And it's wonderful when you're the everybody, but when you've been around it for the last fortnight, it'll probably drive you mad. But he is particularly special, yes.
And it is wonderful to have been able to develop, as you have through your professional career, contacts with internationally recognised artists, but there's probably no single name that resonates in the art world for everybody, artist and perhaps non-art lover alike, as Picasso. And you were invited to the Picasso estate, I understand, to actually have a look at what works you would like to bring back to your gallery in Australia. What was it like to be in a room full of work by Picasso and just to have your choice?
It was quite bizarre. We've probably all seen films in which the Nazi gold hoards are sort of stored underground in Switzerland. And I went into one of these vaults, and I think we went down 8 floors into this extraordinary space. And on each side there were what appeared to be enormous vaults with doors this thick. And we went into one, and there were Picassos from 1908 through to the year before he died, which I think was 1972. And there were drawings, and I was told I could make an exhibition from them. And what do you do? I mean, I just went through them as I would, as if you were a young artist. I fished out pictures I liked and discovered there were 200 of them or something, and I was allowed 25, and went back and put together a show. But it was one thing that was particularly interesting. We went into the sculpture studio where there were bronzes and there were plaster casts, and there was a wonderful, wonderful plaster head of his young lover, Marie-Thérèse Walter, and it had fallen over, and her rather extraordinary Grecian nose, like a sausage, had snapped off. And I told this story to a friend of mine, and when we were in the Picasso show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales 4 years ago, he said, come and have a look. This is the plaster because you can see the mend. And it was riveting.
And you'd seen it in its broken
I'd
condition.
seen it in its broken state, yes.
Yeah.
Art dealers see quite a lot of things in their broken state. Occasionally clients who are up against it and we have to help out.
Yeah.
But we'll go into that later.
So when you were in this vault, looking at Picasso's, an almost movie scenario, Can you imagine back in the day when you were in a military college that there would be any connection between the young Rex Irwin and the Rex that got to choose Picasso's?
None at all. I'm the first person in my family, first male in my family, in 300 years not to go into the army or the navy. So it was both a surprise for them as it was for me.
Was that a very difficult decision for your family? You know, that you didn't go down that pathway? If my father was that sort of person, he would have been upset, but he was one of those soldiers who was shaken about in the war and never really said a great deal. So he didn't understand. Certainly when I said I was showing Picasso, he said, "Oh, the man that does 3 eyes." And I thought, yes, Daddy. So I don't know. He didn't understand it, I think is the answer. So the journey, obviously, when you went to military college as a youngster, did you have a sense of your likely life, your preferred life ahead of you?
My preferred life, I was at naval college, and I assumed it was going to be in the army or the navy. The fact that I wasn't bright enough for either the army or the navy.
Well, that would take some doing.
I know, yeah. So, no. It never occurred to me.
So give us a thumbnail sketch of how you got from being as you modestly put it, maybe not an overperforming young military student. How did you get, first of all, to Australia, and secondly, to find yourself in a position of the world of art?
If I can, before that, apropos school, I have a very nice French friend, and we were talking, and the person we were with said, "Oh, Rex is very well educated." Oh, Jean-Jacques said, no, he is very well brought up. There is a difference." So I wasn't well educated, but I was well brought up. I came to Australia because when I was in London, I was in the wine business, because I had no idea what I was going to do, and my aunt, who was the only person in the family who had any connections to the real world, said, "Well, darling, what do you like?" And I said, "Food, wine, and music." And she said, "Go in the wine trade, I have a friend." So I did. And then I was in the wine trade for 2 or 3 years, starting at the bottom, dear boy, because it's good for you and they don't have to pay you very much. And I had an Australian friend who was quite a celebrated Australian. I think he was a great swimmer of his day, a man called Alan Walker, but not the man from the Wayside Chapel. And he said, "Why don't you go to Australia? They grow wine. And instead of earning £5 a week, you could earn £10 a week." So I came to Australia. I was an economic migrant, basically.
But you made your own way here.
I had to pay because I am actually a Canadian, not an Englishman, so I couldn't become a £10 bond. And the thing that really pissed me off, I paid money and I was on Z deck, and all the £10-pounders were on A deck and B deck.
It would have been deeply frustrating.
Not a good start.
So when you arrived in Australia and saw this new lucky country, you weren't that impressed to start with, were you?
I made my first aesthetic decision. I thought it was hideous. I have never made a nice, nasty, pretty, ugly decision before.
You'll get to like Rex a bit better later. But for the time being,
in 1962, I have to say Sydney was a different place. And it was a rainy September day, and it was also my 21st birthday. And the whole thing was rather miserable. And I said to a taxi driver, I had £100. My aunt gave me £100 for my 21st birthday. So I had £100 in my hand. And I said, "Please take me to a glamorous hotel near a beach." He took me to somewhere called the Astor at Bondi, which later became a bordello and is now a block of flats. So not auspicious, perhaps.
So those were your first impressions of Australia, but if any of us had been around at the time and in the same place as you, what would our impression of you as a youngster arising in Australia have been? What would we have seen? What would we have heard?
They thought I was an upper class wanker, I think. Not to put too fine a point on it. And in those days, there were less people who spoke English like I do, and there were less people who spoke English like the Greeks and the Italians do. So I stood out a bit. But now we all speak our own version of Australian, and I'm forgiven, I hope.
Indeed, well, at least in part because of the extraordinary job that you have done, and I've indicated with some of those names we mentioned earlier, the achievement of getting so much international art to Australia through your gallery, as well, of course, as supporting some very significant Australian artists. But how difficult was it, or has it been over the years, to get international art, people like David Hockney, who we were talking about earlier, people like Picasso and others. How difficult is that to do? How difficult was it to do?
Strangely enough, once I got going, I was in Australia for 18 months and then went back to England and lived there for about 5 years and came back in 1968. And Australia had rubbed off on me enough so that when I went back to England to meet very grand people, I would say, would you lend me? And because nobody had ever asked them, they usually said yes. And so I got the most extraordinary things. Marlborough Gallery lent me Picasso shows. A man in the West End of London who shows Elizabethan portraits. I went into his gallery and there was a very pretty picture in the window. And I said to his assistant, may I have a gallery in Australia? May I ask how much that is? Because I wanted to know, what things cost. A portrait like this of a young man, unknown young man, and she said it was £15,000 or something, which even in those days wasn't very much money. And she said, oh, I'll introduce you to Mr. Weiss, and I met him, and I told him I had a gallery, and he said, well, why don't we do a show together? So I did a show of Elizabethan portraits in Woollahra in, 25, 30 years ago, and we sold an extraordinary number of things here. And when I just asked, which no English dealer would do because these people were too grand. And I'd been here long enough to realise that nobody's really grand. They're either nice or nasty or dull. And
you'll be able to check which one Rex might think you are by asking him after the event. Please line up.
Please don't tell me what you think of me.
That whole process, as you've just been describing, of getting international art to Australia is no small achievement, despite the fact that you make it sound very straightforward. Because you have works by Lucian, Freud, and Egon Schiele, and Henry Moore, and Francis Bacon, and a whole range of people who are really not often shown in Australia, other than by major galleries. What sort of hoops do you have to jump through to be able to do that? Is it really as simple as what you were just describing?
No, because Australian dealers in London in the, when did I start? 76. In the late 70s were thought to be slightly dishonest, because in those days communications weren't as easy and cheques often got lost in the post, and I discovered quite early on that I had to do a bit of repairing Sydney's or Australia's reputation, until one day, I can't think who I was with, but I lost my temper and I said, I am not responsible for their debts. If you want to deal with me, you have to decide whether I'm going to be correct and honest or whatever. And that happened, and the one thing that I promised myself when I started was that I was going to pay the artists very quickly. And in those days, when art didn't cost a lot, and nobody needed it, and Richard said, supporting artists, I was wanting them to support me. I was wanting to make a living out of selling their pictures. But it was much more relaxed, there weren't large amounts of money involved, and people were bad payers. And I tried to make my reputation by being a good payer. And that was what I think worked.
And speaking of that, whole ugly subject of money,
I'm not ugly to us.
but how do you, and maybe not now, but when you were closing deals, and sometimes for very considerable sums of money, Are you prepared to share with us what your approach to closing a deal with somebody who might be wavering was? Because, you know, I mean, I know that there are quite a variety of approaches from different galleries, different dealers around Australia. I won't name names, but one very prominent person who Rex would know has told me that literally he would sometimes lock the door and not allow the person out until they agreed to purchase it. I mean, I'm assuming you didn't actually do that.
No, I didn't. I've never thought of really closing deals in that manner. But there is quite a nice example. I had some Lucian Freud prints that I was showing a new client and his wife who were new to the market, and we love people who are new to the market, and they were faffing about a bit, and it was quite a lot of money. It was $50,000 or $60,000, and there was a woman who I had particularly chosen a picture for, and she came. I had an upstairs room, and there was a moment when you could peer over the top of the stairs and see into the room. And I was talking to these new clients, and I was saying the museums were thinking he's wonderful, this, that, and the other. And this little head popped up, a woman you may know of occasionally, Dawn O'Donnell, recently deceased, but a wonderful, difficult woman. And she popped her head up and said, "Is that the one?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, of course." And disappeared. And the man said, "Was that a sale?" And I said, "Those are the ones we like to do." So I'm not sure how we close deals. One day I did have a very difficult client in to look at some Geoffrey Smarts, and I had a new puppy and I couldn't leave it at home, so I took it to the gallery and I left the man alone with the dog, and when I got up they were both on all fours playing bears, and I sold him a Geoffrey Smart for $85,000. I wouldn't have done it without the dog, I'm sure.
That was your lucky puppy.
It was my lucky puppy.
It's interesting, you were just talking about closing deals and the label, because you've always called yourself, and your business was called Rex Irwin Art Dealer. But there are other labels that you don't like. Tell us about the labels and why.
Well, the one I hate the most, which is the new label, is gallerist. It's a German invention, and I think it makes me sound like a florist. And I may have many attitudes of florists, but I don't like the name. I wanted to actually call myself something nebulous, like Marlborough or Sydney or something. But a friend of mine said, in Australia, you have to use your name so that if you appear in the press or you get sent to prison, the name means something. And so that's what I did. But the art dealer thing, I wanted to make it sort of professional and serious rather than fluffy and woolly. And I think people think art is fun, but for those who make it and those who sell it, it's actually a profession. And you know, it's rather odd. People don't go to their solicitor for a meeting that may cost them, say, only $500 without making an appointment. People come to me and spend $70,000 without making an appointment. So it's a different world, and I wanted it to be just a little bit straightened.
Yes. So that relationship, as you were saying, that relationship is very important with artists. I mean, we talked about some of those international artists that you've represented, or certainly that you've represented here in Australia. But you've also had very, very powerful, very important relationships with Australian artists, people like Nicholas Harding, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the estate of Fred Williams, Cressida Campbell, who's been hugely successful.
She has.
How do you build a really good relationship with an artist? What is the key ingredient?
One of my sort of dicta is that a gallery is only good at those artists that they show. And if you start showing a certain sort of artist, other artists are attracted to you. And this is a conversation that Nicholas Harding relayed to me after the fact. But he came to me and I saw his work 25 years ago, and I thought it was interesting, and I said, we should probably show together. And he said, "Oh." And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Well, I've actually come to see you 3 times before, and you sent me away and told me to come back when I'm better. Does that mean I'm better? And I felt so embarrassed.
So you'd literally forgotten that you'd seen him?
I'd forgotten.
When he wasn't all that
You
good.
see lots of, you see lots of artists, or did in those days, like 5 a week.
Yes.
And you invariably have to say no to most of them. And it's easier now with emails, I have to say. In the old days, we had to confront them face. It must be awful for the artist, just sitting in front of somebody's desk and showing them their pictures. It's like, taking your trousers down and everybody laughing. It must have been, and it was distressing for us to have to say no, but we did.
I hope none of us here have taken down our trousers and been laughed at, but
Not recently.
not recently. But that aside, I mean, there may well actually be. In fact, I know there are some artists here, some of whom may be well represented already, maybe some of whom aren't. What would you now, with that wisdom of hindsight, say to an artist who's perhaps not represented? What would you say to them that they should do in approaching a gallery? What's the best approach?
Well, the first thing I think before you approach a gallery is to enter every prize you can, because there are lots of prizes out there, and there's quite a lot of money out there, and people get chosen. And if you enter lots of things, you may win. Nowadays, it's easier. You can send any number of slides, or whatever they call images, to a dealer, and you don't have to confront them, and we look through them and we can say yes or no. And so I think that side of it is easier, but there are more people doing it. And in the end, you actually have to confront each other, because an image sent on the screen always looks wonderful. It's crisp, it's clear, it's fresh. But if it gets you in the door, that's what you should do. But equally, I think when you have a gallery, as I did, it may not apply now because there are fewer galleries around, you should actually go and see what they have on the walls. And quite an interesting story, we had a young man who all the way through art school came once a month to look at the exhibitions. And so when he came at the end and said, "May I show you my work?" Of course, I said yes, because he had supported me by being there. The least I could do was support him by looking at his work. It didn't happen, but he took a space himself and had a show, and I went to the first night, and every dealer in Sydney was there because he had been to them. And I thought, why doesn't every artist who's at art school do it? Instead of, wearing black and having dandruff on your shoulders and thinking you're smart. Go around and look at the shop. So when you come to me, you can say, the reason I've come to you is you show Nicholas Harding, Cressida, Campbell, Lucian, Freud, Picasso. It's flattering to know that they know what you do. And we each have to live off each other. So it's nicer if it works.
So just expanding a little on that relationship with the artists, I mean, you mentioned prominent Australian artists like Nicholas Harding, Cressida, Campbell. What sort of relationship does a dealer, if that's the word that I can use for you, who has a long time relationship with an artist, what sort of relationship do you establish?
To begin with, you're a nanny. And I had a young woman come to me, and I said, yes, let's do a show whenever. And I rather startled her by saying, do you have a partner? We didn't use the word in those days, I think, boyfriend or something. And she looked startled, and I said, yes. And I said, well, you better warn him now, you're going to be very hard to live with come time the show. Because you're going to be tense, you're going to be making work, and you're not going to be cooking him supper. And a week before the show, she came in looking crestfallen. I said, what's the matter? And he said, he left yesterday. So we have to put up with an awful lot of that. We have to nurse people. First shows are easy in a way because they're usually made before they come to you. Second shows are like second novels, are very difficult. People have an expectation of sales or whatever. They have an expectation of me. And in the end, I don't sell the pictures. The pictures really sell themselves. I present them, I get in the right people, and it's sort of comparatively okay. But it's it's very hard for the artist.
Yes, and those artists, as you say, obviously over many years you build a powerful relationship with them. But I actually want to go back quite a few years now, because we were talking, you know, now you building a relationship with these artists, many of them very prominent. But we left you at one stage here in Australia going, my goodness, you know, why am I here? But what was the process of you getting from that actually into the world of professional art dealing? Because it wasn't something that you started doing.
When I came back the second time, I didn't have a job. But the first time was it the first time? Yes, the first time I worked very briefly for the Barry Stern Gallery. That's right. Getting it wrong. And when I was first here, it was really quite difficult. And I had no connections really. And I left the wine trade after a short time because it didn't quite work out for me. And my knowledge, such as it was European wine. And in those days, Australian wine came in cardboard boxes. And it wasn't the same as it is today. So that finished. And I did what everybody who was out of work in those days did. I sold encyclopedias door to door. And
really?
I was, yes, I did. Yes, I sold encyclopedias. And it was my first summer. And I got heat stroke. And I got unwell and I went to the doctor and he said, well, you can't work for more than 3 hours a day and you can't work for more than 3 days in the week. And I said, how am I going to eat? Who's going to employ me? And he said, I have a friend who has an art gallery. And it was Barry Stern. And I went there and Barry, out of the goodness of his heart, because I must have been both purple in the face from the sun and wonky, and he gave me a job in the afternoons. And in those days, his gallery was in Paddington. It was a little bit rougher in those days than it is, and he kept the door locked. So people had to ring the bell, and one would go to the door and give them a catalogue, let them in. And because, as I mentioned, my voice was more noticeable then than it is now, he said, but please don't speak. So I would go to the door and I would hand them a catalogue and go, run away and hide. And it was at a time when Frank Waters was working there, who's a very celebrated dealer who's just closed. Our generation has sort of just closed. And we used to sit in the back room and Barry would do the thing. And it was then that I realized what it was to be an outsider, finding the inside. Barry was a young Jewish dealer, and his clients were mostly the children of the people who had come as a result of the Holocaust. And they were making their way in Sydney, and a lot of them were in the rag trade, and they were doing terribly well, and they, for some reason, were kind to me, because they had been expatriates, and I was, and so I sort of was made an honorary Jew, which is rather wonderful. The Jewish people coming from Vienna came with a civilized background of music and theatre and coffee shops and conversation, and they brought with them this to Sydney, which was pretty raw, even in the 60s. And Barry, Rudy Coleman, made this the beginning of a magical world, which became the world I worked in for 50 years.
Well, I mean, I think that message of positivity is one that we all do want to hear, that there have been fantastic influences from all sorts of groups of people of all sorts of ethnicity and religious belief and sexual persuasion, and all of that now has changed so much and so positively. And as you were navigating your way, you know, through all of these things as a young, relatively inexperienced person in an art gallery environment, what would you say were, in that broader sense, some of the most important things that you learned about art and about why and how people decide to buy it and decide to enjoy it?
First of all, I think I realised that we all do it differently. But the most important thing was, I think you had to be correct. When you made a deal and you shook hands, it was a deal. An amount of money was involved, but it was a deal. A name-dropping story, when the first Australian painting got $1 million at auction, I had a telephone call from a Mr. Packer who wanted to come and look at some pictures. And I had just had a Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele exhibition of drawings of such extraordinary magic you can't believe. And my Picasso show was on, and I thought, Mr. Big is going to come and he's going to buy our Big. Mr. Big came and said, no, I want to see Australian pictures. So we went upstairs and we looked at younger artists. But Mr. Packer said, what was that picture that got $1 million? And I said, it was an Arthur Streeton. And he said, that's what I want to see. And I said, right, give me a week and I will put together Streetons from all over. So I went to Melbourne and borrowed pictures from Joseph Brown, from Australian galleries, and I brought back 10 or 15 Roberts, Streetons and Condors from the 1880s to about the 1930s. And those of you who know about this particular period of Australian Impressionism, little pictures that were painted in 1889 are worth $3 million. Big, shiny pictures of Sydney Harbour that were painted in 1930 by Arthur Streeton were worth $30,000. And Mr. Packer didn't quite get the difference. And I tried my best to explain it. And then I thought I had sort of lost him as a potential client. And I said, he said, how much is that, the best price? And I said, well, the best price is that less 10% because that's what I'm working on. And he said, well, I don't like people who work for me working on commissions because the more I spend, the more they get. And I was feeling pissed off, and I said, well, you'd have to pay me a fee then, wouldn't you? He said, right, how much do you want? And of course, I never even thought of it. So I thought of the largest amount of money I could think of, and I said, $40,000 a year. He said, I'll give you 50, I'll have that and that and that, less 10%. And he appeared generous, and he saved the whole lot in one hit. And I worked with him, for him, whatever you like, for some years, and he was completely correct. A deal was a deal immediately. And that, you hear all sorts of stories about him, but those of us who've done business with him and with many other people, that is what the soundness in our world is. Because our world is ephemeral. It's only worth whatever you will pay for it, whatever it is. So the deal must be struck. I don't know about the closing, but the deal is struck. And that is terribly important.
I mean, you were mentioning there, you know, some quite large figures of money, not enormous ones in the art world, but there are mind-boggling figures in the contemporary art world now. What do you think about that whole concept of huge amounts of money, millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars for contemporary artworks?
I don't get it, honestly. In the old days, when I started, the old days, certainly is, people, successful people, modestly successful, very successful, bought art with their holiday money, their pin money, their money for treats. Now people see art as an investment, as a form of hedging a market, doing whatever. And so I think it's a little bit like house prices. When you buy a house to invest in rather than live in, you force the market into a different area. And I think that's what happened with pictures. I just don't get it. You can buy a Rubens, one of the greatest masters of all time, for less money than you can buy Jeff Koons. I don't understand it. And that is partly what forced me out of the world, because I can't speak the language of money like that. I don't get it.
Mm-hmm. But you do have a wonderful collection of your own art.
Well, not my art, but other people's art.
Well, yes, exactly. But art that you do have. And so how important and what do you value in the art that actually surrounds you in your home?
Well, before I came to Kangaroo Valley, it was different than it is now, slightly. I have invariably lived alone, and so most of my art is, strange enough, it's pictures of people. It's German expressionist heads, it's Nicholas Harding portraits, it's very little of it is landscape, and I just put it down to the fact that I was so difficult to live with. At least I had inanimate pictures of people on my walls, and so that was my argument. But when I came to Kangaroo Valley, I discovered most of my really important pictures, such as they are on paper, because I think paper is the most wonderful medium for an artist, because it is incorrectable. Once it's there, you can't really get rid of it. And that means there's a sort of immediacy and an excitement. And if it's a print by Picasso, it's $15,000 or $50,000 as opposed to $5 million. So it's affordable. But when I came to Kangaroo Valley, I discovered the house I live in, which faces due north, has an awful lot of sun in it, so I can't put the pictures I want in the places I want. And equally, when you have God at the bottom of your garden, doing whatever he does best, it's... What was that?
I'm only there on Friday.
He's the gardener.
You're obviously doing a brilliant job.
Pictures can't compete. So my dynamic with them has changed.
Yes.
And I don't know whether it means I may sell a picture instead of not. But it's literally the sun on the one hand, which of course is magical, except for last summer, I'm not going to do too much of it. But literally the view, whether it is the whole of Kangaroo Valley, which I sort of look across at Tree High, which even if the rain is pouring, is so beautiful, it's very hard for an inanimate object to compete.
Does that mean that your lifetime feeling about art has actually shifted slightly, coming to a beautiful place?
It's changing a bit, yes. Before, my things were the most important thing in my life. I think what happens at the bottom of the garden, not the gardener, maybe more.
I'm sure he's doing a great job though.
He puts up with me. Apropos education and things, we were having a clash of wills once. Greg said, "You can tell you went to naval school, you're very good at giving orders, but you're quite good at following suggestions." So, we have a very good working relationship.
It sounds like good communication.
Yes.
But speaking of some of that communication, but in a slightly different way, the value of documents and correspondence and a legacy. I know that you have accumulated much over your professional life and personal life, as indeed you should. What have you done with them?
Some years ago, I can't think who it was, somebody said, you should give your stuff to a gallery or a library. And because at the beginning of my career, everything was a letter. You wrote to somebody and they wrote back. And so there were a series of documents, some of which were more interesting than others. I mean, there's one very celebrated Australian artist who lives in Europe, and one of his letters starts off, "No, don't put it in my Australian bank account, put it in my Swiss bank account." So when I gave my archive to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Edmund Capon and Joanna Capon Library, I said we should put an embargo on that till at least 10 years after that person has died, because I don't want the tax man going through his estate.
Should we guess who that was?
We shouldn't guess, no. But so I literally gave everything to the library. I think maybe even the invoices, or copies of invoices. Certainly we gave copies of valuations. So we had letters from, say, Geoffrey Smart, or from Cressida Campbell, or from Frank Auerbach in London. And when you give documents like that, they are valued on a notional amount. A sheet of paper, regardless of what it is 0.6 of a cent or something. And then the more interesting the letter, the more valuable they are. And one of the things that I was given, I'd done a show of photography 30 years ago. It was great success. So I wrote to, I think, the world's greatest photographer of the period, Ansel Adams in America. And this is asking questions, and like an an Australian does. I said, "Dear Mr. Adams, I've always loved your work. If you ever considered showing in Australia, I would love to show your work." And I got a very nice postcard back very quickly saying, "Dear Mr. Irwin, I have now retired from showing at private galleries, but I do wish you great luck with your gallery," signed Ansel Adams, on the back of his most famous photograph of the Yosemite Valley. And when that went to the art gallery, it was valued for $10,000. And I thought, I could have written to everybody in the world and got rejected and made a living out of it. So that's what I've done in the document. And then, because we, of course, were very clever, we had our, whatever they're called, one of those hard drives things, whatever they are, and I've given those to the gallery too, because recently all our correspondence has been on email or whatever, and so that's what we've done with it. Interestingly enough, I did try to give them to the National Library in Canberra, and I hope there's nobody here from the National Library in Canberra, but at one stage I did an exhibition with David Hockney of facts pictures. David is the most fertile of minds. He's shown, for every time there's a new thing, he experiments with it. And I've luckily been the recipient of some of his iPad and iPhone pictures, which are his latest things. But he did facts pictures. And I don't know whether I asked him or he sent me a couple of things as one of his friends. He just put them in the fax machine and sent it to me. And I said, "David, can we do a show of your fax pictures? It won't be for sale because they are ephemeral, and we didn't quite know how ephemeral actually." And so at some ungodly hour, like 7 o'clock in the morning, I think he was in Los Angeles, I would stand by the fax machine and these things would come chugging through and I would tell him if there was one page that wasn't good. And luckily I was obviously brighter than I thought. I said, "Please may I reprint these on acid-free paper rather than on fax paper." So I was allowed to do that. And so I put all the fax original things in, you know, like sensitive envelopes. And we had the show. And because they were, or the ones we exhibited were on proper paper, I had a whole exhibition of David Hockney's fax pictures, some this big, that had no real value. I was the only commercial gallery in the world that did it because I asked. So I wanted to give them to Canberra, to the National Library, because being bits of paper, I thought they would know how to look after them. 6 months of trying to get somebody to answer the telephone without a recording and get a reply, I gave up. I rang the Art Gallery of New South Wales Library on a wet afternoon, and the following wet morning they came round and said, "Yes, wouldn't that be wonderful? Thank you." And it was wonderful. And interestingly enough, can I ramble on?
I think we're we're here for exactly that. It's lovely to hear.
A client rang me and said, "I know you're retired, but do you have any records that go back to the picture we bought 20 years ago?" And I said, "I don't. They're all in the library at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. They may or may not have been catalogued. Have a go." This man sent me an email 10 days later and said, "It was extraordinary. I rang them up, I told them what I wanted, and they came back to me not only with my invoice that I was wanting for the provenance of the picture, but much more than I needed. You will be pleased to know your things are in good hands." And that was extraordinary. It was wonderful. So any student can now go and say, "What did you say to David Hockney? Did you have a fight with Nicholas Harding? Is the reason that person came to you?" Whatever. But going back to a previous question, why people came to me as artists, they often came to me because their dealers weren't paying them. And an artist, whose name we have mentioned, but we won't mention again, came to me and said exactly that. And I said, "Can I ask how much you were owed?" And I was told $40,000. And this was at a time when it was an enormous amount of money for anybody, let alone a young artist. And that's my reputation for paying got me that artist.
Well, it's a very fine reputation, and it's been lovely to share so much of the other perspectives of your both professional and personal life. And I think we will live with that wonderful image of you at one end of a fax line machine and David Hockney across the world at the other end, and those things going back and forth. Wonderful stories. So for those stories, ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank
On the dot.
Well, more or less on the dot, because I do want to make sure that we have at least just a couple of minutes of opportunity for you perhaps to put a question or two to Rex if there's something that
Not you.
that people would like to ask. So yes, please.
Did you have any formal training at all in art?
No, none at all. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. No, I was at a naval school. We didn't do art in naval school. We did seamanship and signals. My training was very stern for probably 3 years altogether. Excuse me. Then I went to work from.
Sorry to interrupt. Could we just keep down the conversations just until we do finally wrap up? Thanks.
I went to work for a man called Frank MacDonald at Clune Galleries, which was in Macquarie Street, and he had shown Arthur Boyd, Drysdale, everybody, and he was looking back to showing Rupert Bunny, Emmanuel Phillips Fox. I worked for him for 10 years, so I got to understand the modern artists as well as the historical artists. But in those days, I don't think we were selling quote-unquote art to the same degree we are now. We were selling pictures. We were mostly dealing with living people who were doing things. And in those days, artists weren't as pretentious as they are now. They were sweet people who did things because they had to and came to me because they thought they might be able to sell them. So my experience was on the hoof. I did little things like, because of my English connection, it involved me in England, and because of the 3 most important artists of the period, Frank Auerbach, Lucian, Freud, and Leon Kossoff, excluding the most important, Francis Bacon, were German, were Jewish. So I started to look at the Germans, and I became a little bit known for doing some exhibitions of German expressionist pictures in the last 10 years of my career. So, no real experience except on the hoof.
Well, but a lot of experience.
On the hoof.
Do we have another question?
Yes, yeah.
Hi. After these years working with so many different artists, how would you find good art?
I think
big question.
when I was younger, I might have been arrogant enough to take a stand, but I wouldn't. I think art, like football or something, when you confront it, excites you a little bit, and then you follow the excitement. I still, when I go to the greatest galleries in the world, I don't go to see a Piero della Francesca or a Picasso. I wander around and look at the things that engage me. And if they engage me, as a dealer, I never said to them, this is art. I basically said, this is something I like, you might like it. And of course, some of what I liked was based on what was in museums, art history, but I don't think you can say what art is. There's another silly story. In the days of Dada, these were the first people that were the cause of all the horror that we're experiencing in the art world now, where everything is art if you decide it's art. The great voice of Dada, I think it was André Breton, who wrote about Dada, asked a young, I think it was Man Ray, a young photographer, if he would photograph some of the Dada objects he'd been given, because he wanted to have a record of them. So this young photographer went to his house and he looked at these mysterious bits of stuff that everybody thought was absolute hell, and he photographed them. And Breton said, of course I can't afford to pay you, but I will give you a lovely lunch. So the photographer enjoyed the lovely lunch, and then Breton said, and when may I see the photographs? And he said, well, I'm terribly sorry, I didn't have a film in my camera. But as you know, it's the idea that matters. I hope it's a true story.
It ought to be.
It ought to be. So the answer is, if it excites you, that's a start.
Yeah.
And then you look more and you listen to other people.
Yeah.
Because we ain't always right.
Thank you. Next question.
Rex, I was fortunate to see one of the last exhibitions you put on of the Fred Williams estate, some really sublime paintings. I was just wondering if you could comment on where you see Australian landscape painting in the international context.
Could people at the back hear that question?
Yeah.
Yep, great. Thank you.
I think, in all honesty, we don't make the international scene very much. And if you'd seen the show of Australian landscape painting at the Royal Academy 5 years ago, you would know why. It was terrible. But, interestingly enough, before Williams became as celebrated as he is now, let's say 25 years ago, the people that in London would certainly have known of Sidney Nolan. He was the great Australian painter. But if you now go to the Tate and you go to the National, the painter they want to see is Fred Williams. Because Sid provided us with the icon, with Ned Kelly, which was extraordinary to love. It was the easiest way of telling the Australian story. And then Fred Williams realised that there's an awful lot of Australia, and it has been looked at, and it's been realised in a realistic way, which didn't quite get to the essence of it. And Fred made this shorthand. In fact, he basically said, there is nothing out there, you have to make it in the studio. So what his landscape painting is really an invention from the mind. But if you actually fly over Australia and you see these little beads of shadow lying all over the thing, you realise, as one of my friends said, Fred Williams designed Australia. There is this extraordinary abstraction, but it's actually strangely literal. And for those people who don't know Fred's work particularly, they're little, as it were, balls of pigeon shit all over the landscape. But if you look at a gum tree, the only thing that's tangible about it is the little shadow of leaves at the top. The trunk is almost invisible. So you see just this little ball of stuff. And when you see a strong line in Fred Williams' paintings, it's where there has been a creek around which trees have grown. And of course, being Australia, the creek has dried up, and the trees have usually been burned and they fall. So you get this dark pattern of dark verticals, which are basically burned tree trunks, with these little other balls of things. And they are so evocative that's, you know, the Metropolitan in New York has, I think, 3 or 4 big Williamses, which are often hanging among the New York School of Abstraction. And he is the artist that more thoughtful people abroad know of. They still know Sidney Nolan. Strange enough, they don't know Arthur Boyd at all. London knows a bit about Arthur Boyd because Arthur lived there. And of course he lived here, and interestingly enough, local knowledge, the man I worked for at Clune Galleries bought Bunderman, and I would work for him during the week, and he would try and get me to come down at the weekend to mow his grass. And I said, Frank, I'm prepared to work for you for money, but I don't want to work for you for nothing. So I didn't come down, and I actually find the Bunderman landscape slightly intimidating. It is that dry, crisp Shoalhaven landscape, which is, I don't empathise with, whereas I love the lushness of the Kangaroo Valley and the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, cows and sheep all the way down the coast from what I used to call between Kiama and Death. And I think that is what appeals to me.
We couldn't leave this. I'm sorry. We are actually going to have to wrap it up. But I was just going to say we couldn't leave it at a better point than a description of the locale and a war now that you have begun between
Kangaroo and Death.
between Kangaroo Valley and the Shoalhaven.
Yes.
So we've had some wonderful insights and some wonderful stories, ladies and gentlemen. Please thank Rex Irwin.
Richard, thank you. And thank you Richard Morecroft fan club. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you all very much.